So when we get into these next sections, this is really where Nietzsche begins to talk about what he calls the death of tragedy. And so the birth of tragedy covers the whole lifespan of tragedy. And as I talked about a little bit at the end last time, this has to do with Socrates and Euripides as well. Nietzsche sort of begins the passage in 14 by asking us, "Let us now imagine the one great cyclops eye of Socrates fixed on tragedy, an eye in which the fair frenzy of artistic enthusiasm had never glowed. To this eye was denied the pleasure of gazing into the Dionysian abysses." So that element of Socrates is one that Nietzsche focuses on almost exclusively in this work. I mean, we had a little bit at the end of his sort of criticism of the image of the dying Socrates becoming the new ideal, of the value of knowledge, the value of truth, the value of reason, being so great that one ought to be willing to throw away one's life in the service of it. And, this is because Socrates, of course, does this in a way that Nietzsche in his early work actually praised, that he martyrs himself with a sort of the same serenity, the same, what would you say, the same just nonchalant ease with which he leaves the talk at the end of the symposium when everyone's drunk and hungover and, still sleeping in past the break of day. Socrates goes and carries out his day as though nothing had happened, as though he had not stayed awake all night drinking and giving speeches on love. He just goes and washes himself and begins the day as normal, right? And that's how Socrates dies, that he goes to death with a sort of ease, and that the nobility of this image and the power of this image nevertheless, therefore, idealizes something which is somewhat pathological to Nietzsche. But here, what he focuses on, and it's sort of the thread throughout of the real sort of the danger of Socrates, but he also talks about a sort of a nuanced sort of upside to this, the danger, this opposition of Socrates, that he is anti-artistic, right? And that he is the philosopher as opposed to the poet. That is one of the defining features that you see throughout the Platonic dialogue, is this distrust of the poets. And as Nietzsche sort of psychoanalyzes Socrates, this is because he is an unartistic person. He doesn't have any artistic instinct. His eye is denied the pleasure of gazing into the Dionysian abysses. So that the break of the principle of individuation and the absorption of the self into the primordial unity and all of the contradictory and arbitrary and indifferent, realities of nature, the cruel reality of nature. Socrates doesn't have that capacity, and therefore he always he doesn't actually understand art, and opposes art on that basis because art is irrational, because it is not something that can be, obviously he makes a distinction between the techniques of the various arts, and the actual divine madness of being, possessed by a god or a muse. Socrates has respect for the technique, that which can be learned and passed on, which is can be sort of taught according to a set of rules or principles that can be then followed. And you can sort of have a definitive right or wrong way of doing a given technique. But when it comes to the actual creative expression, it seems that the primary thing that Socrates sees in this, what would you say, this art force, whenever it radiates through mankind, is danger. And that's what he's often talking about in the Republic, is how certain musical scales and modes can trigger or bring on certain emotions or mind states, and therefore people of certain stations in society, such as the soldiers, should only be allowed to listen to martial music. And nobody should listen to music that makes them gloomy and sad and lachrymose, or however he puts it, because none of that is conducive to behaving as in the most excellent possible way, in the most virtuous possible way. And that's sort of the central thrust of the Republic, is how do we live in the most virtuous way? And since that is Socrates' goal, these things that are all based upon the Apollonian principles of know thyself and all things in moderation. Socrates is, in a sense, sort of a child of the Apollonian. Now, the important caveat to that is that the Apollonian is an art impulse, and without the Dionysian, there's an implication that we will get to later that you sort of lose the Apollonian as well. Maybe a more paraphrastic way of explaining that'll make sense of it, is that the way Nietzsche has described the Apollonian is as since it's an artistic principle, there comes with it the idea that this is an illusion, this is a fiction, that when we individuate things and we draw boundaries, we are behaving arbitrarily, that there is you can draw, within the boundaries of the idea of this thing called the self and the series of duties that we have created within the boundaries of society and civilization and the morality that we've constructed. If you start from certain starting principles, you can extrapolate what the logical way, to reach the proper conclusion is, right? But the axiomatic starting principle itself is something which you have to, in some sense, arbitrarily cling to or arbitrarily assert. And that Socratism is naturally opposed to the idea that the individual self or the morality that governs society is actually in any way illusory, that to the Socrates, these are actually the most real things. So even though we can see how the Socratic might sort of pay homage to or bear a family resemblance to the Apollonian is about redemption through illusion. And Socrates, ultimately, Socratism is opposed to illusion, as it is opposed to all art. That ultimately the Apollonian is still an artistic force, and Socrates, this offspring of the Apollonian, maybe we could say, nevertheless sort of transcends it in being anti-artistic, and therefore anti-illusion, anti-fiction, anti-anything that's unreasonable or self-contradictory, right? And so we talked a little bit about this last time, but when he says we imagine the Cyclops eye of Socrates, so he's single-minded, right? He has monovision. He's simply looking at whether or not this is intelligible, whether it's reasonable. And everything is put through that lens with Socrates. And when he looks at tragedy, what does he find? Quote, something rather unreasonable, full of causes apparently without effects, and effects apparently without causes. The whole, moreover, so motley and manifold that it could not but be repugnant to a sober mind, and a dangerous tender for sensitive and susceptible souls. We know the only kind of poetry he comprehended, the Aesopian fable, and this he favored, no doubt, with the smiling accommodation with which the good honest Gellert sings the praise of poetry in the fable of the bee and the hen. Quote, poems are useful, they can tell the truth by means of parable, to those who are not very bright, end quote. So the Aesop's fables, this is common knowledge, but these are simple morality tales like the tortoise and the hare, right? Slow and steady wins the race. That's the moral of the story of the tortoise and the hare, right? A lot of us know the story that I believe is the fox and the grapes. So we get the term sour grapes. So these are fables, they're fictions, right? But they're pedagogical, they're instructive, they're there to impart a moral lesson. So the story has an internal logic to it that shares in the sort of Socratic project, the utility of the Socratic project, which is bringing about virtue, right? Allowing people to live in a virtuous, reasonable, ethical way, the way that will produce the greatest, harmony and flourishing. And so Socrates, of course, the only kind of, poetic production that he comprehends is the Aesopian fable. When he looks at tragedy, he sees this world which is ultimately conjured out of, to Nietzsche's mind, conjured out of wild, ecstatic, collective hallucinations under the affect of intoxication, right? And so, of course, there are, what are you to make, full of causes apparently without effects and effects apparently without causes? I mean, the chorus, the body narrating the action, intercedes to affect the action at times, things of that nature. So the hallucinatory origins of tragedy, the intoxicated, ecstatic origins of it, make it basically completely contrary to it's like almost like a contrary form of dramatic poetry compared to the Aesopian fable. And so to Socrates, it seemed that tragic art did not even tell the truth, and moreover, it addressed itself to those who are not very bright, not to the philosopher. So that little set of verses by Gellert that Nietzsche quotes from there, the poem is useful because it's a parable for those who aren't very smart, that can't maybe understand something like they're not going to listen if you give them the Kantian categorical imperative as to why they should behave a certain way. They need to hear it, in the form, illustrated in the form of a fable. And so that's, just fine for someone like Socrates, but Nietzsche's sort of saying this tragedy is double indicted because it doesn't tell the truth, and it's basically an anti-philosophical, well, not anti-philosophical, because Nietzsche says that the form of tragedy, has its own form of philosophy, I suppose, but it's anti-Socratic just as much as the Socratic is anti-artistic, this, zenith of the Greek art form. It's completely opposed to the idea that those who live by reason and by wisdom will flourish and win out in the end, or that the human experience can be contained within the narrow range of solvable problems, right? That's sort of Nietzsche's critique of Euripides. But we'll get to that more later. So the rest of the paragraph basically says that it's sort of Nietzsche's evidence that Socrates was anti-artistic. He says that, quote, Plato burned his poems that he might become a student of Socrates. But where the unconquerable propensities struggled against the Socratic maxims, their power, together with the impact of his tremendous character, was still great enough to force poetry itself into new and hitherto unknown channels. An instance of this is Plato, who, in condemning tragedy and art in general, certainly did not lag behind the naive cynicism of his master. He was nevertheless constrained by sheer artistic necessity to create an art form that was related to those forms of art which he repudiated. Plato's main objection to the older art, that it is the imitation of a phantom and hence belongs to a sphere even lower than the empirical world, could certainly not be directed against the new art. And so we find Plato endeavoring to transcend reality and to represent the idea which underlies this pseudo-reality. Thus, Plato, the thinker, arrived by a detour where he had always been at home as a poet, at the point from which Sophocles and the older art protested solemnly against that objection. If tragedy had absorbed into itself all the earlier types of art, the same might also be said in an eccentric sense, of the Platonic dialogue, which a mixture of all extant styles and forms, hovers midway between narrative, lyric, and drama, between prose and poetry, and so has also broken the strict old law of the unity of linguistic form. Okay, so what's interesting here, so we have the completely unartistic Socrates, but his student Plato is where it's in the Platonic dialogues that we have, basically all that we have of Socrates. And Nietzsche's pointing out is that Plato, in writing this down, innovated a completely new genre that hovers between narrative and lyric, between drama, between prose and poetry, and it breaks the old law of the unity of linguistic form, basically. And so what he's saying there, the Platonic dialogue is an artistic expression of Plato's, and that unlike Socrates, Socrates didn't actually feel the need to write anything down the way that Plato did. And the reason why Plato, therefore, it's sort of like, it's a good thing for the Socratics of today that there was an artistic impulse in Plato, even if it didn't exist in Socrates, that compelled him to want to write as beautifully as the poets, right? That's Plato's famous line. And coming from that background of poetry, and yet, writing his philosophy in this new way, in a way which is dramatized, in a way which is, it consists of these dialogues interspersed with story narration, and has philosophical elements, has dramatic elements, and so I think that more or less gets the point across there. That Nietzsche sums it up in the next paragraph that, quote, "The Platonic dialogue was, as it were, the barge on which the shipwrecked ancient poetry saved herself with all her children, crowded into a narrow space and timidly submitting to the single pilot, Socrates. They now sailed into a new world." So, and basically Nietzsche says that Plato creates, in some sense, the novel, which I'm not sure if the Socratic stories qualify as novels in the strict sense, but maybe Nietzsche's using the word in a different way. But he says that basically the Socratic dialogues can be described as an infinitely enhanced Aesopian fable, in which poetry holds the same rank in relation to dialectical philosophy as the same philosophy held for many centuries in relation to theology, namely the rank of ancilla, which means handmaid. So, Nietzsche is using the analogy that would be familiar to any European, post-Enlightenment, that, look, for centuries before the Enlightenment, philosophy was the handmaid of theology. Theology was the the pinnacle of research, metaphysics and apologetics and all of these things, biblical study. That was the raison d'etre of the university, to which philosophy was merely a handmaiden. He's saying, so it's the same relationship in the Platonic dialogue, that poetry, dramatic expression, artistic expression, is merely the handmaiden of philosophy. And this comes out stylistically as well as in content. Because again, in Plato's Republic, in terms of the content, the philosophical content, the argument is that poetry should serve literally that the philosopher king should rule the society, or the philosopher rulers, the ruler class of the guardians who are philosophically educated, should rule the state, and that the poets will therefore be subordinate to them, and then therefore that the philosophy of this ideal state would shape what kinds of poetry, right, which kinds of artistic expression are permissible in accord with the governing philosophy, right? And so that's sort of the content. But even in form, right, like in the Republic, Socrates quotes from all of these, old tragic plays, and from the, Iliad, and all these old poetic sources, all these old verses and lines of dialogue, and sort of critiques them and says which of them will be permitted in our Republic and which ones shall not be, right? So he's using literary criticism of, sort of the poetic canon of Greece up to that point, and saying these are he's placing himself as a judge above it, right? Of these are the poetic works that have been produced that I approve of, and poetic expressions that I approve of, and these are the ones that I do not, in accord with my philosophy. So even in terms of both the content and the form, poetry is the handmaiden of philosophy when it comes to Socratic philosophy. And so he says that that's the new position which Plato, under the pressure of the demonic Socrates — remember, Socrates has a demon, which means a personal deity, that is his conscience, and it's his instinct that is critical and negative, which is to say that his instinct is towards dialectic and criticism and skepticism, whereas his intellectual faculty is what is creative and what gives birth to things in Socrates. And Nietzsche says this is sort of the reverse of the ordinary type of man, and that's what's so monstrous about Socrates. So in any case, the next paragraph, quote, "Here philosophic thought overgrows art and compels it to cling close to the trunk of dialectic." So that was more or less explained, I think, by the examples I was talking about from the Republic. And so next in the paragraph, Nietzsche says, quote, "The Apollinian tendency has withdrawn into the cocoon of logical schematism. Just as in the case of Euripides, we notice something analogous, as well as a transformation of the Dionysian into natural affects." So remember, that's his assessment that Euripides, rather than representing the Apollinian and Dionysian art forces in his work, actually has sort of cheapened them into pale imitations. The Apollinian, taking the place of that, is sort of like cool, and he says even like nuanced, subtle, paradoxical thoughts, basically sublime intellectual dialectic, and then fiery, passionate affects, right? Characters display these displays of emotion and tugs at the heartstrings, instead of this. Really, those are just sort of superficial, technical means of moving along a story or conjuring feelings in the audience, where sort of the deeper religious mythic meaning, we'll use the term mythic, of the Apollinian and the Dionysian really involves individuation and dissolution, which are far more fundamental than any of those sort of superficial displays of the intellect or wit, or battles of wit, or displays of a character in the deep throes of emotion, right? That we're talking about literally the creation of self and the destruction of self in a very real experiential sense. That's what it meant in the earliest religious rituals, right? That has been basically withered away and no longer exists in the dramatic form post-Euripides. Now, Socrates, the dialectical hero of the Platonic drama, reminds us of the kindred nature of the Euripidean hero, who must defend his actions with arguments and counter-arguments, and in the process often risks the loss of our tragic pity. For who could mistake the optimistic element in the nature of dialectic, which celebrates a triumph with every conclusion and can breathe only in cool clarity and consciousness? The optimistic element which, having once penetrated tragedy, must gradually overgrow its Dionysian regions and impel it necessarily to self-destruction, to the death leap into the bourgeois drama. So the optimistic nature of the dialectic which celebrates triumph with every conclusion. This is very clear in the Platonic dialogues, where sort of every, every point that Socrates wishes to make. We go through a series of struggles over a number of points that have to be clarified, assumptions which we had, which need to be challenged and examined. And then at the end, we come to some clear definition or conclusion according to the principles we've been following, and we say, well, therefore, X must be true. And so Nietzsche is sort of seeing this dramatically, or like the narrative of this form, the dialectic. He's artistically criticizing philosophical dialectic. I understand that's what he's doing. And to the degree that it appears in, for example, the Euripidean drama, right? I mean, really here he's drawing a direct comparison to the Euripidean hero who defends his actions with arguments and counter-arguments, versus, that's almost the entirety of what goes on in the Platonic dialogue is a battle of arguments and counter-arguments. And so, but the narrative structure there is ultimately optimistic, because in the end, the character always gets somewhere. We always actually arrive at some conclusion or insight, and therefore what we have an image of is characters achieving success and then being positively changed in some way, like they have some new wisdom or knowledge or virtue that they didn't have before. And therefore, progress is possible, and it's an optimistic message, therefore. It's not, this is sort of Nietzsche's criticism of dialectic as inherently anti-tragic. Okay, so Nietzsche then says, quote, "Consider the consequences of the Socratic maxims. Virtue is knowledge. Man sins only from ignorance. He who is virtuous is happy. In these three basic forms of optimism lies the death of tragedy. For now the virtuous hero must be a dialectician. Now there must be a necessary visible connection between virtue and knowledge, faith and morality. Now the transcendental justice of Aeschylus is degraded to the superficial and insolent principle of poetic justice with its customary deus ex machina. So I'll say a few words about the accuracy of this accusation, which has been called into question by many in posterity. Accuracy in terms of, is this actually an accurate attack on Euripides? But let's just sort of take it for granted, perhaps that it is, or take it as a general art criticism of Nietzsche criticizing optimism in the arts, or drawing attention that there is a difference between tragic art and optimistic art, and that optimistic art seems to be premised, at least for the most part, on these Socratic maxims, these three basic forms of optimism, as he calls them. And we might say that this tendency exists in our contemporary art to a great degree, and that we expect there to be a certain amount of poetic justice, to use the old form of the word, right? That, like, yes, there are forms of art that are like intended to be hyper-realistic, where the good guy does not always win in the end. But typically that's not a blockbuster. I mean, you remember when No Country for Old Men came out and the good guy doesn't win in the end. Sorry, spoiler alert. I mean, it has been out for more than 10 years. But, or like There Will Be Blood, it came out at the same time. And that's another movie where there's no sort of like justice in the world, that, the main character is a complete, misanthrope, sociopath who, is like prideful and ambitious and arrogant. And in the end, he doesn't have any sort of like character change. He says he wants to buy like a fancy house with a white picket fence and rot inside that house, and that's what he does. And he, like, there's no recompense for any of the crimes that happen, and there's no sort of sense of moral justice. We might say that in like the old Twilight Zone is a show with a great sense of poetic justice, or like the original Star Trek show in the 1960s, or that we see this. Those, I would say, are sort of like admirable examples where they are almost like Aesopian fables that are attempting to teach you something. But that more broadly, we see this sort of optimistic tendency that the films that I just like rattled off that were sort of major blockbusters are very, very rare. And that we sort of expect that, the good guy has to win in the end. All the evil has to like be appropriately punished at some point in the story. And in the past, actually, Hollywood actually had codes for this, where you couldn't portray the bad guy getting away with the crime, right? And so, in any sense, Nietzsche is saying that this is the death of tragedy, that being able to portray a world in which the most virtuous man does not win in the end, where in fact they meet the awful fate that you might reserve for a character that the audience absolutely hates within this sort of universe of poetic justice. Nietzsche sort of admires the inherently unjust portrayal of the world within tragedy, in which there is no higher, deus ex machina. There is no God in the machine that is watching over the play. There is not, the opposite of sort of the Goethe's Faust, where the play is prefaced in a prologue by telling the audience that God has already sort of ordained all the events that are going to happen, right? And the main character is going to be redeemed. That in tragedy, what we see instead is simply the destiny of the, great hero to be ripped to shreds. So, and why? Why would Nietzsche make that criticism? Because he believes that's honest. It's the fundamentally unjust aspect of nature that you're seeing in this, and that the illusion, the attempt to legislate the Socratic illusion into art that virtue brings happiness, and that man sins from ignorance, and by virtue, by following knowledge, which is virtue, which is the same thing, right? You can actually solve the problems in your life and affect positive changes and progress. Nietzsche's very much against that in art. Now, again, I said I'd say a word about the accuracy of this accusation. Kaufman has a footnote where he says that Aristotle called Euripides the most tragic of the poets, and then Kaufman writes, quote, "Although Nietzsche has more feeling for poetry and tragedy than Aristotle did, this estimate seems fairer than Nietzsche's conception of Euripides as the most optimistic. Surely Euripides did not believe that he who is virtuous is happy. On the contrary, and the superabundance of dialectical fireworks in his tragedy, though it does dissipate the tragic emotion, usually illustrates the futility of reason and its inability to prevent tragedy." And I think, end quote, and I think Kaufman's right about that, and I think the Bacchae, which was the play we talked about the last time, is actually a good example of that. So it might be fair to say that Nietzsche's not being entirely fair. Okay, but again, we can, a lot of times, that's sort of something that I wouldn't get too caught up on, because that's sort of like a esoteric philological debate that isn't as important to us now. What's important is to see the broad strokes of Nietzsche's really philosophical distillations out of this whole examination of Greek dramatic tragedy, and because we could say that whether Euripides himself actually is guilty of these charges, he has a huge influence on New Attic comedy, which does sort of coincide with a logicizing, what Nietzsche calls later Greece becoming an Alexandrian culture. And this is based on an actual sort of anthropological divide in the periods of ancient Greek history, moving from the Hellenic period to the Alexandrian period. So again, we need not sort of get bogged down in the specifics. We can just sort of say that in the zeitgeist, Euripides was part of it, according to Nietzsche. But the important thing is to understand the contours of the zeitgeist as he's pointing them out. Okay, so next paragraph. As it confronts this new Socratic optimistic stage world, how does the chorus appear now, and indeed the whole musical Dionysian substratum of tragedy? As something accidental, a dispensable vestige of the origin of tragedy. Well, we have seen that the chorus can be understood only as the cause of tragedy and of the tragic in general. End quote. So, just to recapitulate briefly, the Dionysian substratum. Nietzsche believes, tragedy born out of the spirit of music. Music is Dionysian. The Dionysian is that gaze into the abyss of the destruction of the individual and rejoining of the primordial unity and the pain and contradiction of existence. That is what forces its way into the psyche through music and ecstasis, and the chorus is an expression of this. And through the interaction with the Apollinian, you eventually get tragedy, but the Dionysian is sort of, it's built into the deepest layers of the foundation. And while the chorus is like the evidence of this origin, by this time, so Nietzsche actually writes, he mentions that even in Sophocles, I'll just gloss over this, he already, the perplexity in regard to the chorus was already there. And that he had already sort of limited the amount of what Nietzsche calls the sphere of the chorus, or the participation of the chorus, the centrality of the chorus to the tragedy that already exists in Sophocles, who's one of the great tragedians. And so that's sort of Nietzsche's evidence that even by this period, the earlier forms of tragedy, which came out of the religious ritual, were already sort of becoming diluted, and people were sort of beginning to forget their understanding of what tragedy was and where it came from and what the chorus was. And so to the purely Socratic mind, which is completely alienated from all this, what do they see in the chorus? It makes absolutely no sense. It just sort of becomes an ornamental aspect of the drama that can be sidelined or relegated to the intervals between scenes. Skipping a little further down, he talks about how Sophocles altered the position of the chorus. They were they appeared almost coordinate with the actors, as if elevated from the orchestra into the scene. Okay, so remember, the chorus was that sort of magical wall between the spectator and the Dionysian world taking place within the scene. And remember that orchestra and scene, these are actual like places within the amphitheater in their original use of these words. So by altering the position of the chorus to be practically coordinate with the scene, Sophocles quote, or well, Nietzsche says, quote, this alteration in the position of the chorus is the first step toward the destruction of the chorus, whose phases follow one another with alarming rapidity in Euripides, Agathon, and the New Comedy. Nietzsche continues, quote, optimistic dialectic drives music out of tragedy with the scourge of its syllogisms. That is, it destroys the essence of tragedy, which can be interpreted only as a manifestation and projection into images of Dionysian states, as the visible symbolizing of music in the dream world of a Dionysian intoxication. End quote. So all of that, I think, should be relatively straightforward, given, if you've been following along this whole time, what tragedy is. And so notice the dichotomy he's drawing here. He starts out, the important dichotomy is between Apollo and Dionysus, but really here it's between the artistic and the Socratic, right? And he's saying that the introduction of dialectical syllogisms into the artistic is like introducing arsenic into a carbon-based life form. It's absolute opposite. It's antimatter. And the more we attempted to constrain the tragedy into Socratic logic, the more that we destroyed it. And this begins to happen with alarming rapidity as each step sort of falls like dominoes into the next. So next paragraph, quote, if we must thus assume an anti-Dionysian tendency operating even prior to Socrates, which merely received in him an unprecedentedly magnificent expression, we must not draw back before the question of what such a phenomenon as that of Socrates indicates. For in view of the Platonic dialogues, we are certainly not entitled to regard it as a merely disintegrating negative force. And though there can be no doubt that the most immediate effect of the Socratic impulse tended to the dissolution of Dionysian tragedy, yet a profound experience in Socrates' own life impels us to ask whether there is necessarily only an antipodal relation between Socratism and art, and whether the birth of an artistic Socrates is altogether a contradiction in terms. End quote. Okay, so if the chorus is already sort of misunderstood by the time of Sophocles, and there's already a sort of logical tendency emerging in Greece, of which Socrates is just sort of a more full expression or manifestation, then that means that Socrates might not be inherently anti-artistic as a phenomenon. The phenomenon of the Socratic mindset and worldview might not be inherently anti-artistic. Now, the birth of an artistic Socrates, that concept, I think, is of central importance to Nietzsche, because he's basically letting us know his hopes here. This is a hopeful passage, because Nietzsche still has great respect for Socrates and admiration for Socrates, and as I've pointed out, has many parallels to Socrates himself. And I think one of the ways we could understand Nietzsche as by someone attempting to manifest that type of the artistic Socrates. And so he's saying, the very fact that we have the Platonic dialogues, that we have this artistic expression of Socratism, because Plato does, it's like he didn't just write dry logical treatises like Kant. There are completely unartistic forms of philosophy. Platonic philosophy is actually pretty artistic. But Socrates, in terms of content, when we're looking at what Socrates had to say, it was all very unartistic. And so in the expressions of Plato, and coupled with the fact that Socrates isn't really the origin of the anti-artistic, he's just sort of its fullest expression, Nietzsche wonders if this is a necessary truth, if maybe Socrates might not have been, and this is another point, this is an important point. Again, Socrates is, his evaluation or his valuation of science and logic as the highest goods, as, the truth as the thing to die for, is in itself irrational and arbitrary and therefore has an artistic character to it. We talked about all this in our introduction to this text in the preface. So, that's sort of the contradiction and the irony within Socrates, is that it is his artistic or his aesthetic to be the anti-aesthetician. And so Nietzsche sort of wonders if there's a way in which that contradiction could be synthesized in an artistic Socrates. And he doesn't really give us a sketch of it. What he does is he recounts this particular story from Socrates' life, from the end of his life, which indicates that Socrates had actually deep within him perhaps an impulse, an instinct, an inclination that told him there is a part of life that is served by being artistic. And I've read this on the podcast before, but we'll read it again. Quote, "For with respect to art, that despotic logician occasionally had the feeling of a gap, a void, half a reproach, a possibly neglected duty. As he tells his friends in prison, there often came to him one and the same dream apparition which always said the same thing to him. Socrates practiced music. Up to his very last days, he comforts himself with the view that his philosophizing is the highest of the muses, and he finds it hard to believe that a deity should remind him of the common popular music. Finally, in prison, in order that he may thoroughly unburden his conscience, he does consent to practice this music, for which he has but little respect. And in this mood, he writes a prelude to Apollo and turns a few Aesopian fables into verse." I'll end quote here. So we see how, as I argued at the beginning, the Socratic is related, or you might see it as an offspring of the Apollonian art impulse. And so maybe by reintegrating that Apollonian art impulse, the Socratic soul or the Socratic type could affect this change into the artistic Socrates. Maybe we could interpret this passage in this way. Because notice it's Apollonian forms of art that he chooses to practice. And the Aesopian fable, the story, the artistic work as a form of pedagogical moral teaching, which is a form that Socrates can understand. But the next thing Nietzsche writes is very interesting. Quote, "It was something akin to the demonic warning voice that urged him to these practices. It was as Apollonian insight that, like a barbaric king, he did not understand the noble image of a god and was in danger of sinning against a deity through his lack of understanding. The voice of the Socratic dream vision is the only sign of any misgivings about the limits of logic. Perhaps, thus he must have asked himself, what is not intelligible to me is not necessarily unintelligent. Perhaps there is a realm of wisdom from which the logician is exiled. Perhaps art is even a necessary correlative of and supplement for science." End quote. And so here we have it. As I said, Nietzsche doesn't really sketch us a picture of the artistic Socrates, but he gives us he points us in the right direction, and it's a direction he would take up for the rest of his career. And I think, again, we see like the full flowering of this in his great work Beyond Good and Evil, that Nietzsche begins to, so he says, it's like this voice of his inner demon, this Apollonian warning voice, is telling him, you don't understand, you might sin against a god from lack of understanding. There might be limits to logic, right? And so, in a way, if everything is to be made intelligible in the Socratic worldview, if that's what the Cyclops eye of Socrates does, is ever fixated on reason and intelligibility and coherence and, all of these things we've been talking about that constitute Socratism, isn't it the Socratic duty then to understand art? That's something that Socrates has never understood and that he's always seen as chaotic and self-contradictory and not worthy of his understanding. Maybe that's what that voice in the back of his head is telling him, is that it's your duty to understand this. From the same Socratic duty that you've taken upon yourself to pursue the truth, you have to then therefore understand the truth of art. And maybe, as Nietzsche asks again at the end, art is even a necessary correlative of and supplement for science. And so this is sort of what we were talking about earlier. You can derive logical conclusions following from a set of first principles. But what those first principles are, at a certain point, you can keep going back to the very foundations of your knowledge, but at a certain point you have to suspend doubt and affirm something. Or else no knowledge is possible. And this insight in Nietzsche, that all of our reason is based on the irrational, and that our truth is based on falsehood, is built on the foundation of falsehood. You could say that Nietzsche is being an artistic Socrates by daring to follow the will to truth, to carry out his project of following through on the will to truth, to even turn its light back around to the foundation, the root of the will to truth itself, and to see then the irrational valuation of truth itself that sits at the foundation of the will to truth, and see how that in itself is artistic. And so this passage here in Birth of Tragedy, I think it points the way towards one of the central and most interesting aspects of Nietzsche's philosophy, is his relationship to the will to truth, and then by extension, his sort of exploration of art and science and how they interrelate, and how science might be made more complete or healthy by integrating its artistic foundations more consciously into itself. Okay, so we'll move on to 15. So I mentioned earlier how Socrates is a dangerous and destructive force, but how this could have a positive side to it. And so this is where Nietzsche brings that up, that quote, "In the spirit of these last suggestive questions, it must now be said how the influence of Socrates, down to the present moment, and even into all future time, has spread over posterity like a shadow that kept growing in the evening sun, and how it again and again prompts a regeneration of art in the metaphysical, broadest, and profoundest sense, and how its own infinity also guarantees the infinity of art. Before this could be recognized, before the innermost dependence of every art on the Greeks, from Homer to Socrates, was demonstrated conclusively, we had to feel about these Greeks as the Athenians felt about Socrates. Nearly every age and stage of culture has at some time or other sought with profound irritation to free itself from the Greeks, because in their presence everything one has achieved oneself, though apparently quite original and sincerely admired, suddenly seemed to lose life and color, and shriveled into a poor copy, even a caricature." And a little further down in the paragraph he says, quote, "Unfortunately, one was not lucky enough to find the cup of hemlock with which one could simply dispose of such a character, for all the poison that envy, calumny, and rancor created did not suffice to destroy that self-sufficient splendor. And so one feels ashamed and afraid in the presence of the Greeks unless one prizes truth above all things, and dares acknowledge even this truth, that the Greeks, as charioteers, hold in their hands the reins of our own and every other culture, and that almost always chariot and horses are of inferior quality and not up to the glory of their leaders." And so that is all just to say, we'll get to Nietzsche talking about why Socrates ever prompts a regeneration of art. But that Nietzsche really does feel that these tendencies that he's identified within the Greeks, these art forces, still obtain within our world today because we are descended from the Greeks, and that the Socratic problem, even as the sun set in the Greek culture, the shadow cast by Socrates just becomes longer and longer and longer in the sunset, because the influence of the Socratic over our mind state has not by any means diminished, as we are still in the hands of the forces that drove Greek culture. They're still driving Western society today, and so we still have to deal with the same fundamental problem. Whether we believe that or not, I think it's certainly open to debate. But next paragraph, he sort of gets back to the idea of what the significance of Socrates truly is in terms of how he prompts this regeneration of art while also being artistic and a sort of a threat, a degenerating, dissolute force on art as well. And so in the next paragraph, he says of Socrates that, quote, "It is enough to recognize in him a type of existence unheard of before him, the type of the theoretical man, whose significance and aim it is our next task to try to understand. Like the artist, the theoretical man finds an infinite delight in whatever exists, and this satisfaction protects him against the practical ethics of pessimism, with its Lynceus eyes that shine only in the dark. And as Kaufman notes in his footnote, Lynceus is one of the Argonauts who was so sharp-sighted he could see through the earth and distinguish objects almost 10 miles away. So, like the artist, the theoretical man finds an infinite delight in whatever exists. We might remember earlier when Nietzsche was sort of praising, or maybe this is actually in the pre-Platonic lectures where he says the first philosophers, sort of their great triumph, one of their great metaphysical triumphs is the fact that they're able to attribute so much metaphysical significance to even the most mundane phenomena. That every, what would you say, like every pattern or phenomenon we encounter in nature, no matter how ordinary, in the mind of the philosopher becomes an object of great attention and significance. And, he sees this not just as a trait of philosophers, but as we've seen with his comments throughout this text about the Greek mind and its penchant for, precision and its ability to retain precise, form and line and color and all of that. He sees in Socrates, again, interpreting Socrates as an artist. He's saying, like an artist, the theoretical man. So remember, the first Socrates is the exemplar of this type and the pioneer of the type. He finds an infinite delight in whatever exists. And so this satisfaction of his infinite delight in whatever exists protects him against the practical ethics of pessimism. What are the practical ethics of pessimism? Well, we might say that the practical end of a pessimistic world outlook might be something like Schopenhauer. That ultimately we conclude that it is happiness that is what really matters, and the way we define happiness, ultimately, the only logical way we can do it is as the absence of suffering. We look around and see existence is characterized by suffering, and that therefore, it's better never to have been. That's the wisdom of Silenus again, right? And so that's why he sort of brings up the metaphor of Lynceus's eyes that shine only in the dark, is sort of the clear-eyed, honest, pessimistic outlook of someone like Schopenhauer, again, could lead us to a practical ethics which are fundamentally anti-life, and that perhaps what we're seeing in this little passage in Birth of Tragedy is a recall of Nietzsche's early characterization of Socrates in those pre-Platonic lectures as the first Lebensphilosopher, philosopher of life, that the theoretical man actually offers something to society, that the reason, again, that all of these things where Nietzsche sort of says are dangerous or a source of degeneration or, a calamity for society or culture, that oftentimes these things are not affected by a archetype or a figure who is, unremarkable or unextraordinary or has no redeeming qualities or nothing positive or powerful about them. I mean, quite the contrary. If Socrates was not a powerful figure with much that was admirable about him and much to offer, that he didn't fulfill some need or offer something to the society at large, he would not have, he would not have transformed it as he did. And so what he offers is almost something that is on the aesthetic level here. Yet again, it's an almost solely aesthetic analysis of Socrates, which is what the things that's so bizarre about this book and so wonderful about it. And what Nietzsche writes next clarifies this. He says, quote, "Whenever the truth is uncovered, the artist will always cling with rapt gaze to what still remains covering, even after such uncovering. But the theoretical man enjoys and finds satisfaction in the discarded covering, and finds the highest object of his pleasure in the process of an ever-happy uncovering that succeeds through his own efforts." End quote. And we'll look at what Kaufman's footnote is here, where he compares it to Section 4 of the preface to The Gay Science, which was also reprinted in Nietzsche contra Wagner. And Nietzsche takes issue in this passage with those who, quote, "want by all means to unveil, uncover. We no longer believe that truth remains truth when the veils are withdrawn." So that recalls Heraclitus, doesn't it? That we no longer believe that truth remains truth when the veils are withdrawn. Well, what does that mean? Your veil, which is the Apollonian illusion, right? Your perspectival representation of reality, which is inherently non-universal, non-absolute, and bounded within certain constraints and limitations. When you remove all those constraints and limitations and ways in which our mind naturally falsifies the world, Nietzsche says it's not as if you have a noumenon remaining when you remove all of that. That in fact, the truth is in those bounded, limited, perspectival experiences. The truth is in the phenomenal world, because all of those things are what constitute the world of phenomena, which is real in our experience, even if we could point out all of these, limitations of our experience. And so the truth is in the way that the world appears, not in the way that the world is, quote unquote, actually is, if we take away all of the limitations of human perception. Because the limitations, the removal of the veils or the lenses for understanding or perceiving reality, it doesn't help you perceive reality more clearly. It's that perception of reality is only possible. It's only possible for reality itself, whatever that might mean, to, quote unquote, appear within the phenomenal experiential world of direct experience, right? And so, as we know from Heraclitus, what it is, the nature of being is revealed. The phenomenal world is the cloth of being. Becoming itself is being, right? Or another way of putting it is that he rejects being in favor of becoming, but let's not get too Heideggerian here. So elsewhere in that same passage Kaufmann quotes from, Nietzsche says, we have learned, quote, to stop courageously at the surface, the fold, the skin, to adore appearance, to believe in forms, tones, words, in the whole Olympus of appearance. Those Greeks were superficial, out of profundity. Are we not, precisely in this respect, Greeks, adorers of forms, of tones, of words, and therefore artists? End quote. And so that is a very interesting way of classifying the Greeks, but it makes sense given the way Nietzsche has talked about the Apollonian dream world that he believes the Greeks lived in. And we can see all the way at the end of Nietzsche's career in The Twilight of Idols how the true world became a fable passage, which I began the podcast with, which I think is very central. The abolition of the metaphysical world and the embrace of the phenomenal world, the world of appearances. Nietzsche sees this in the Greeks back in the gay science period, and I think Kaufmann is correct to correlate those passages here to Nietzsche saying, whenever the truth is uncovered, the artist will always cling with rapt gaze to what still remains covering, even after such uncovering. But the theoretical man enjoys and finds satisfaction in the discarded covering and finds the highest object of his pleasure in the process of an ever-happy uncovering that succeeds through his own efforts. So, philosophy has an artistic grounding. It has its own aesthetic. Nietzsche is saying the artist is choosing to focus on what still appears or still remains as covering, which is the artist is always concerned with the world of appearance. And this is what Nietzsche finds to be so wonderful about the Greeks. The theoretic man, though, he finds his satisfaction in the discarded covering. What does that mean? It means that, Socrates is, again, his instinct is to negate, to challenge, to question, to critique, and he finds the highest object of his pleasure in an ever-happy uncovering, and ever critiquing and ever removing the sort of the veils of appearance. And so we can see in that the passages from the gay science that, as Kaufmann puts it, Nietzsche takes issue with those who want, by all means, to unveil and uncover. So that's the basis of Nietzsche's critique in Socrates, and we can see in that same passage his praise of the Greeks as artistic and sort of, again, the difference between the art, or the opposition between the artistic and the theoretical man. But again, he's saying he says it's the type of the theoretical man whose significance it's our next task to try to understand. So Nietzsche's not necessarily just trying to tear down the theoretical man here. And again, perhaps the admirable thing is that we can see the will to power in a figure like Socrates in that ever happy process of uncovering the truth that succeeds through his own efforts. And so we can see in that sentence, Nietzsche is seeing the process of will to power as a overcoming of challenges, the will to power driving the will to truth. At this very early date, long before Nietzsche had either of those ideas really clearly formulated, he already sees how the will to power, or tacitly expresses how the will to power drives the will to truth here. And so, to gloss the next paragraph, he sort of says, you could look at this as like a critique of the scientific progressivist mindset or something like that, where he says, imagine, a bunch of men who wanted to dig a hole straight through the earth, and that, or a man who wanted to dig a hole straight through the earth, who would realize that in his entire life he would only be able to dig a very small part, and that he would have to, it would have to be like a sort of intergenerational project. And basically that, how could you really derive meaning from this task? We might say that the task of drilling through to the earth, to the other side of the earth, is sort of Nietzsche's metaphor for quote unquote finding the truth with a capital T, right? So maybe to put it in concrete terms, the theory of everything, as they talk about in physics, right? If you would regard that as truth with a capital T, or some explanatory framework that explains everything, where there's no more like relevant or significant portions of the world or existence of which we are ignorant anymore, right? And Nietzsche sort of presents this as sort of an impossible task, where he says, you could try your utmost for your whole life, but even that would be filled in before your own eyes by the labors of the next in line, so that a third person would seem to do well if you picked a new spot for his drilling efforts. So it's sort of inherently futile. And so he says, quote, suppose someone proved convincingly that the goal of the antipodes cannot be reached in this direct manner, who would still wish to go on working in these old depths unless he had learned meanwhile to be satisfied with finding precious stones or discovering laws of nature, end quote. So digging deep into the shaft of scientific inquiry, he's presenting a psychological theory based on will to power here in a very, 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 very provisional, inchoate form that I don't think he fully recognizes. We're just seeing how this was implicit in Nietzsche's thought already, that unless someone actually gains some sort of pleasure from the small trivial accomplishments and the examination of the surface level phenomena, or learning things like laws of nature in the course of trying to get to this, goal of truth, right? That it sort of, in some sense, I could see somebody of a modern scientific progressive mindset saying, well, Keegan, we don't have this goal of this far off truth that we're trying to capture as Nietzsche presents it. That's a straw man. And how true, I think Nietzsche is almost agreeing with that here, saying that, look, the attainment of some sort of mythical, all-encompassing truth with a capital T is not something science can bring us, and therefore each individual scientist must therefore psychologically be getting something more out of science, out of that sense, which we could maybe source to how he concludes the previous paragraph, of finding the object of his pleasure in the process of this ever-happy uncovering of overturning of illusions, removal of ignorance, and each of those is succeeding through your own efforts, so you're able to feel strong or powerful, however you might want to put it. And Nietzsche puts this really with a fine, very concise, much more concisely than I've been doing, beginning in the next paragraph, where he says, quote, therefore Lessing, the most honest theoretical man, dared to announce that he cared more for the search after truth than for truth itself, and thus revealed the fundamental secret of science. to the astonishment and indeed the anger of the scientific community. Okay, so there you have it. I mean, in this quotation of Lessing's, or this passage of Lessing's, the actual quote, Kaufman actually includes it, where Lessing says, quote, "Not the truth in whose possession any man is or thinks he is, but the honest effort he has made to find out the truth is what constitutes the worth of man. For it is not through the possession, but through the inquiry after truth that his powers expand, and in this alone his ever-growing perfection. Possession makes calm, lazy, proud," end quote. And so, I mean, there we have it, the idea of happiness being found in goal-directed activity and movement instead of passivity and possession, that it's not in the attainment of a goal that one finds happiness. We can see how Nietzsche's background and Schopenhauer predisposed him to see this, and then how this statement of Lessing, right? Lessing literally says, it's through inquiry after truth that his powers expand. And so the expansion of one's power, right? The pursuit of the truth, not the possession of it, whatever that might even mean, to have the truth with a capital T, right? We almost even can't conceive of what that would entail. You'd have to have like godlike knowledge and or infinite knowledge, right? And so you might say, I guess that's like the hypothetical limit of truth seeking would be infinite knowledge. And that's like you trying to dig a hole through the center of the earth. It's freaking impossible. And so it's actually, if we look at it logically, it's the search for truth that is important, not truth itself. And so, therefore, and again, this is a conclusion Nietzsche does not draw until much later in his career, it is actually, the fulfillment you're actually finding is in the exercise of your individual power and your accomplishments, and the feeling, therefore, of your power expanding and becoming more perfect. That's where you're actually deriving your contentment in the search for truth. It's the will to power undergirding the will to truth. It's just interesting, even though it's not explicit here, we can see, knowing the direction of Nietzsche's later philosophy, how these ideas are being sown here. Okay, so, quote, "Beside this isolated insight born of an excess of honesty, if not exuberance," so that insight of Lessing, that it's the pursuit of truth, not truth itself, and its attainment that matters. Nietzsche says, quote, "There is to be sure a profound illusion that first saw the light of the world in the person of Socrates. The unshakable faith that thought, using the thread of causality, can penetrate the deepest abysses of being, and that thought is capable not only of knowing being, but even of correcting it. This sublime metaphysical illusion accompanies science as an instinct and leads science again and again to its limits, at which it must turn into art, which is really the aim of this mechanism." So this is a much crazier claim than I think it sounds like at first pass. So to really break this down, and I don't think I really fully agree with it, actually. But so Nietzsche is saying, the unshakable faith that thought, using the thread of causality, can penetrate the deepest abysses of being. So we have the imagery of, Ariadne and the labyrinth, right? Using the thread, the ball of thread is causality. And that thought is capable not only of knowing being, but even of correcting it. So that's sort of the Socratic, that's the premise of all the Socratic philosophy, is that through reason you can correct your being, your existence. Your existence, as we discussed in the last sections we analyzed in the last episode, the Socratic attack is upon unconscious knowledge, upon instinct, upon anything not brought into the light of reason. Reason is, thought can rule being and correct it. Thought can be the thing that guides us through the labyrinth, the chaos of existence. Now, we know what later Nietzsche's more articulated, fully expressed objection to this would be, that in fact he sees thought as a superficie and skin, as part of the appearance, and not, or as an after effect, not itself the cause of activity or action, that the instincts and impulses are actually primary. And so we can use that somewhat to try and get at what he's saying here, that when he calls it a profound illusion, that sees the light of the world in the person of Socrates. It's that, in fact, it is Socrates's. This is more or less what he says again in the 1886 preface, that it's Socrates' instinct or impulse that ultimately produces this phenomenon of Socratism, right? And so once again, it is thought following impulse, even though that impulse is towards reason as all-encompassing and tyrannical. But so he says that we then, therefore, we lead science, that this sublime metaphysical illusion that reason can correct being, right, accompanies science as an instinct. And so that would be perhaps the common justification that we hear for science, right? Is if you ask someone, what is the point of doing science? What is the value of science? The first thing you'll get is the utilitarian, typically what you hear from people when they say, well, the truth matters and it's valuable. Well, why is it valuable? Well, look, we can, look what medical science does. We can treat all these diseases now. We put men on the moon. Science works. Science gets results, right? So science is good because of the good effects it produces, because of the utility that it gives us. And so knowledge correcting being, right? We've corrected the suffering. Now no longer do 1 in 4 children have to die, pretty much, be miscarried or die within the first year of their existence, as was the norm for most of human history, right? We can correct that horror of, just children dying as a matter of course, of being cold because they're sickly from existence. We can correct that. So this sublime metaphysical illusion accompanies science as an instinct and leads it again and again to the limits at which it must turn into art, which is really the aim of this mechanism. So the aim of the mechanism, which tells us that reason can correct being, is to turn science into art. What does that mean? Well, it means, perhaps it's best to move on to the next paragraph where he really clarifies this, where he says, quote, "The image of the dying Socrates as the human being whom knowledge and reasons have liberated from the fear of death." So that's reason correcting being, right? The inherent pain and psychological suffering of the knowledge of our own mortality, right? One of the central human problems. Socrates provides the image of someone who has transcended that through reason. Therefore, reason has corrected being. And so that is the emblem, the dying Socrates, that, quote, "above the gate of science reminds all of its mission, namely to make existence appear comprehensible and thus justified. And if reasons do not suffice, myth has come to their aid in the end. Myth, which I have just called the necessary consequence, indeed the purpose of science," end quote. And so what does this imply? Again, just as people say when they justify what the point of the scientific pursuit or the scientific project is, it's in all the good utility that it brings. Nietzsche's saying on a deeper level, this pursuit, this will to truth that is driving science, this entire scientific mindset of reason correcting being, is an attempt to make existence appear justified. If existence is comprehensible and therefore justified, it's an attempt to redeem reality. And thus, the Socratic is another attempt to, it's another expression of the will to power attempting to give us a means by which we can live. It's an attempt at enticing us to life, as Nietzsche, again, he recognizes in all of his early work on Socrates. And that the dying Socrates is sort of its founding myth. It produces this narrative, this which is inherently an artistic project, this myth, which is inherently something religious, which attempts to move us and attempts to produce this idealized, illusory dream image, this shining light by which we can live and find our way in the world in the form of the dying Socrates. And so, in the next paragraph, he says, quote, "Once we see clearly how after Socrates, the mystagogue of science, one philosophical school succeeds another, wave upon wave, how the hunger for knowledge reached a never suspected universality in the widest domain of the educated world, became the real task for every person of higher gifts, and led science onto the high seas from which it has never again been driven altogether. How this universality first spread a common net of thought over the whole globe, actually holding out the prospect of the lawfulness of an entire solar system. Once we see all this clearly, along with the amazingly high pyramid of knowledge in our own time, we cannot fail to see in Socrates the one turning point and vortex of so-called world history. End quote. So, later, again, I think it is instructive to see how in the beginning of this book, we have the opposition between Dionysus and Apollo. Now we have the theoretic man versus art, versus the artistic. And here he's just called that the emergence of the theoretic man, and how he basically has, borne up science into, he's referencing things like, the lawfulness of an entire solar system. Like how revolutionary that is if we're aware of how pre-scientific human beings didn't necessarily see the world as lawful, that they believed that they lived in a magical world where all of these apparent laws could easily be suspended by gods or spirits, and things that they didn't understand or expect happened all the time. And so it was a world that was far less certain and seemed far less regular. And the fact that we look up at the heavens and think we sort of have the presumption that we have it mostly figured out, like the law, we don't understand everything, but with this Socratic drive in our hands, we can sort of bound the entire world in these like mathematical concepts and pattern nets, right? That is so revolutionary that Nietzsche sees the emergence of the theoretic as the turning point of world history. And again, since he sees all of our cultures in the West as inherited from the Greeks and still being steered by the driving impulses of the Greeks, and the theoretic casts that long shadow over the Greeks in their late period, Socrates, this is why Socrates is sort of the main enemy or opponent of Nietzsche's in this work. Again, there is that silent hostility towards Christianity, which will be more fully developed later. But these inner chapters of The Birth of Tragedy are really, I think, the tastiest meat of this early Nietzsche book is the attack on Socrates. But as we've pointed out throughout, couched oftentimes in a sort of what would you say, a tone of admiration for him. Now, quote, "For if we imagine that the whole incalculable sum of energy used up for this world tendency had been used not in the service of knowledge, but for the practical, i.e. egoistic aims of individuals and peoples, we realize that in that case, universal wars of annihilation and continual migrations of peoples probably would have weakened the instinctive lust for life to such an extent that suicide would have become a general custom, and individuals might have experienced the final remnant of a sense of duty when, like the inhabitants of the Fiji Islands, they had strangled their parents and friends. Practical pessimism that might have even generated a gruesome ethic of genocide motivated by pity." A little further down he says, "This is present in the world wherever art did not appear in some form, especially as religion and science, as a remedy and a preventive for this breath of pestilence," end quote. I have to say, I try to present all of Nietzsche's arguments as plausibly as I possibly can, and this is where he kind of loses me, where it's important to note that he's essentially praising Socrates here, or giving another positive point that in the decay of Greek society, right, this transition into the Greek cheerfulness that he's taken so much issue with in the Socratic tendency, if all that energy hadn't been poured into Socratism, if it had been poured into the practical, which he designates as the egoistic aims of individuals and peoples, so sort of a Schopenhauerian view of the subjective will, of unmoored from any sort of metaphysical or moral demands, right? It would have been like chaotic apocalyptic nihilism and genocide out of pity, right? Just sort of, I don't know, the conservative or Jordan Peterson nightmare of a crisis of meaning, where people just take revenge upon existence for the crime of being, right? I don't know how plausible this is. I also don't know. I haven't looked into what he's talking about with the Fiji Islands. But we'll just say the most significant part is that he classifies religion and science as emerging from art. I think this is the unity that we've talked about of the early sort of mythic as like the artistic, spiritual, deeply emotive experience that happens at sort of the edges of individuation and dissolution in the both in the subjective experience of the individual, but also in whole groups, that produces religion and science. They come on a foundation of art. And again, as Nietzsche said earlier, that artistic aim in order to justify or redeem reality, right, is even the point of science and religion. So, again, that's that artist metaphysics at the base of this work. It's not exactly representative of what Nietzsche thought later, but it's very interesting that he commits to it so wholeheartedly. It's almost like a different writer from later Nietzsche in some respects. Very radical things that he says in this work. That's why I like it so much. And so, quote, by contrast with this practical pessimism, Socrates is the prototype of the theoretical optimist who, with his faith that the nature of things can be fathomed, ascribes to knowledge and insight the power of panacea, while understanding error as the evil par excellence. To fathom the depths and to separate true knowledge from appearance and error seemed to the Socratic man the noblest, even the only truly human vocation. And since Socrates, this mechanism of concepts, judgments, and inferences has been esteemed as the highest occupation and the most admirable gift of nature, above all other capacities. Even the most sublime ethical deeds, the stirrings of pity, self-sacrifice, heroism, and that calm sea of the soul, so difficult to attain, which the Apollinian Greek called sophrosune, which means temperance, but Kaufman says that's not quite adequate, but it's as close as we can get. These were derived from the dialectical knowledge by Socrates and his like-minded successors down to the present, and accordingly designated as teachable, end quote. So again, this is really just another sort of summary of the theoretical worldview. And remember what we talked about in the 1886 preface, that really the essence of Socratism is optimism, it's theoreticalism, or whatever you want to call it, and morality, right? It's the idea that through reason, one can act morally in such a way that progress is attained. So those three sorts of aspects. And the idea that you could actually reach that, he says, the calm sea of the soul, or in political terms, that you could reach that utopian republic, in scientific terms, that we could actually reach infinite knowledge, that sort of thing. Okay, so next paragraph, we'll say, and this is another way, this next paragraph is another instance in which Nietzsche is explaining how Socrates provided an inducement to life, an attraction to life, how even though he has all this criticism for the optimistic, and how it's dangerous to art, how it destroyed tragedy, how it doesn't understand the, Apollinian basis and illusion that it requires for its existence. Nevertheless, quote, anyone who has experienced the pleasure of Socratic insight and felt how, spreading in ever-widening circles, it seeks to embrace the whole world of appearances, will never again find any stimulus towards existence more violent than the craving to complete this conquest and to weave the net impenetrably tight. To one who feels that way, the Platonic Socrates will appear as the teacher of an altogether new form of Greek cheerfulness and blissful affirmation of existence that seeks to discharge itself in actions. We'll just end there. So, again, for all the criticism, this is perhaps correlated. We can relate this passage to his idea of what would have happened had there not been this outlet for all of that pent-up energy in Greek society to flow into the optimistic, Socratism. Next paragraph, quote, science, spurred by its powerful illusion, speeds irresistibly towards its limits, where its optimism, concealed in the essence of logic, suffers shipwreck. So that's what he's talking about again, of this tendency of following reason in order to correct being, leads to the moments where optimism and the scientific project, reach their limits and then give way to art. Nietzsche says, quote, "For the periphery of the circle of science has an infinite number of points, and while there is no telling how this circle could ever be surveyed completely, noble and gifted men nevertheless reach, ere half their time, and inevitably such boundary points on the periphery from which one gazes into what defies illumination. When they see to their horror how logic coils up at these boundaries and finally bites its own tail, suddenly the new form of insight breaks through, tragic insight, which merely to be endured needs art as a protection and remedy. Our eyes strengthened and refreshed by our contemplation of the Greeks, let us look at the highest spheres of the world around us. Then we shall see how the hunger for insatiable and optimistic knowledge that in Socrates appears exemplary has turned into tragic resignation and destitute need for art. While to be sure, the same hunger on its lower levels can express itself in hostility to art and must particularly detest Dionysian tragic art, as was illustrated earlier with the fight of Socratism against Aeschylean tragedy." End quote. So, Aeschylean tragedy. Remember, Nietzsche says, in Aeschylean tragedy, Moira, fate is enthroned above gods and men. So even the gods lament their fate. They are not all-powerful. And, so great and powerful beings and heroes are still pushed around by sometimes harsh and or cruel destinies. And remember Aeschylus's Prometheus. Prometheus takes it upon himself to shape men in his own image, to defy the gods, and is, which is something that elevated and uplifted men, which is all of us, humankind, and yet Prometheus is punished for this in the most horrific way. To the Socratic, that which uplifts or perfects man, it would completely betray the sense of poetic justice if, that was punished. if he who taught men to be more perfect and more godlike was, shamed and destroyed and tormented eternally, that completely goes against the theoretic or the morality of Socratism, or the progressive view of Socratism, that, man ought to be punished for stealing fire from the gods. Nietzsche brings us up at the end to say how the Socratic took up a fight against these tendencies in Aeschylus. That's just what it found, to be antithetical to the Socratic insatiable hunger for optimistic knowledge. And nevertheless, he sort of, in the previous paragraph, talks about how when we reach those limits of logic, which he hasn't really done a good job giving us a concrete example of, but which he hinted at in Socrates' desire to understand art and music and to practice music, basically when he's in the days nearing his death, only because he has an idea that he hasn't really penetrated into this other world that is denied to the logician, the strict logician, which is the world of, music. And, even though it is Apollinian and it's only him doing some verses of Aesopian fables, Socrates still feels, in his own example, he eventually resigns himself to having to practice the arts in order to, penetrate into or understand, to follow his will to truth even there, into that which he finds incomprehensible. We might also just say that, broadly speaking, Nietzsche could simply be appealing to the idea that, when the scientist realizes that they can dig forever in their shaft of scientific investigation and never actually hit bedrock, and that they're simply that the scientific will to truth is simply an expression of the will to power, and that really what they're getting their fulfillment from, or what they're deriving it from, is their, the expansion and perfection of their own powers and the experience of their expanding powers and successes in their given domain of ambition. And that, science ultimately, in its study of the phenomenal world, can't give us any metaphysical truths, that it will never exhaust all that which we can know. There are many who when they reach sort of the limits of philosophical or scientific inquiry, the limits of logic, do turn to mysticism and religion. And so maybe on just a very plain-faced reading of the text, that's what Nietzsche is talking about. But in any case, also how the Socratic is its own aesthetic, and that this is an attempt to redeem the world, and it has its own mythos in the form of the dying Socrates. So all of these things. But in any case, he ends this section with a recall of the artistic Socrates idea and its future importance in his thought, where he says, quote, will this turning lead to ever new configurations of genius, and especially of the Socrates who practices music? So that really is what Nietzsche is looking for. And he says, quote, will the net of art, even if it is called religion or science, that is spread over existence, be woven ever more tightly and delicately, or is it destined to be torn to shreds in the restless, barbarous, chaotic world that now calls itself the present? Concerned but not disconsolate, we stand aside a little while, contemplative men to whom it has been granted to be witnesses of these tremendous struggles and transitions. Alas, it is the magic of these struggles that those who behold them must also take part and fight. And Kaufman says the book might well end at this point, as the original version did. The original version was called Socrates and Greek Tragedy. And basically, Kaufman notes, the discussion of the birth and death of tragedy is now finished, and the following pages, the following sections, 16 to 25, are about the rebirth of tragedy. And Kaufman notes these are the sections that Nietzsche most regrets. That being said, there's actually, so we're going to go at a little bit faster in the final sections of the book past this point, because there is actually a little bit less of philosophical content and a little more Wagnerian fanboyism than that might be tasteful. But nevertheless, there are interesting ideas. I mean, like, we haven't even gotten to the idea of the Alexandrian, Hellenic, and Buddhistic cultures, which are sort of that idea doesn't come up until these later chapters, and that's one of the most interesting ideas to me in Birth of Tragedy. So with that being said, we will continue into the, we'll call sort of the later chapters of Birth of Tragedy that are not in the original, on Socrates and the opposition of the theoretic to the tragic, but indulge now in the idea of the rebirth of tragedy, which, again, this has to do with the obvious, candidate for the rebirth of tragedy is Wagner, because Nietzsche has made a case that a sort of complete cultural revaluation can be effected out of the spirit of music throughout this whole first 15 chapters of the text. And so it would be, again, on the wings of music that you could effect a cultural revivification, or it's sort of a new turning, maybe a rebellion against that theoretical Socratic view of life, which impels us now to utilitarianism, and Nietzsche would say far worse, to democracy and socialism and all these things, right? But these, to me, even though the specifics of Nietzsche's case and his thinking at the time is something he would later criticize and move on from, and it doesn't really bear any relevance to us today, the idea that you could see a rebirth of, Nietzsche's talking specifically about, quote unquote, the tragic, but that you could have a rebirth of certain art forces or cultural feelings or mind states within collective society is a very interesting idea, and I think it bears some examination. So we are going to finish the text, even though Kaufman thinks it might as well just end here. So, 16. And I'll just read this first paragraph here, because I think Nietzsche... Well, actually, no. I'm going to read the entirety of the second paragraph, because he gives a really good summary so far, which he kind of has been doing throughout, and I think it's generally a good practice to do that when you're making such a complex philosophical case as Nietzsche makes in this text. But He just starts out saying, by this elaborate historical example, so the interplay of the Apollonian and Dionysian creating tragedy, and then tragedy's eventual death, as a theoretical zeitgeist sweeps society. He says, by this example, we have sought to make clear how just as tragedy perishes with the evanescence of the spirit of music, it is only from this spirit that it can be reborn. And so remember, to make things very simple, it's the Socratic misunderstanding of music, an attempt to make music and poetry, these Dionysian forces, subordinate to reason, the handmaid of reason, or the philosophy, right? And so through that sort of theoretical attack on the artistic force of the Dionysian, which is primarily expressed through music, tragedy dies, and as the spirit of music dissipates, the tragic perishes. With a revival of the spirit of music and can be reborn. Now, he says, quote, in my examination, I shall leave out of account all those other antagonistic tendencies which at all times oppose art, especially tragedy, and which now are again extending their triumphant sway to such an extent that of the theatrical arts only the farce and the ballet, for example, put forward their blossoms. And so, skipping a little further, he says, I will speak only of the noblest opposition to the tragic world conception, and by this I mean science, which is at bottom optimistic, with its ancestor Socrates at its head. And a little later on, I shall also name those forces which seem to me to guarantee a rebirth of tragedy, and perhaps other blessed hopes for the German genius. And so, there is a war being waged between insatiable optimistic knowledge and the tragic need of art. And we might see in the other forces which are antagonistic to art, right? You might consider, for example, economic forces. Like Nietzsche was very much, or like we might say class-based forces, because Nietzsche was very much put off by the aristocratic and bourgeois element in attendance at the first, like, Bayreuth Festival, for example, because, art should be uniting everyone of the same common cultural fabric. Even in spite of Nietzsche's elitism, he always believed this, that, the Greek mysteries were the times where Greeks were joined together as Greeks and all joined into this primal unity, as he's been talking about throughout the text. And so, maybe there's economic opposition to art being able to have that power, right? Or we might think of, Christianity. That would be, as he says in the preface, Christianity is anti-artistic because it attempts to elevate morals above everything. And so it takes the moralism that exists in Socratism and turns it up to 11 to the exclusion of all else, in a sense. That's one way of looking at it. It's how he talks about it in the 1886 preface, is that everything, art must be of secondary concern to the moral view of life in Christianity, for example. But he says he speaks here only of the noblest opposition to the tragic world conception, which is science. Science embodied by Socrates and therefore defined as the insatiable hunger for optimistic knowledge. So that's a very good way of clearly orienting what he's talking about here. Next paragraph, he says, before we plunge into the midst of these struggles, let us array ourselves in the armor of the insights we have acquired. In contrast to those who are intent on deriving the arts from one exclusive principle, as the necessary and vital source of every work of art, I shall keep my eyes fixed on the two artistic deities of the Greeks, Apollo and Dionysus, and recognize in them the living and conspicuous representatives of two worlds of art, differing in their intrinsic essence and in their highest aims. I see Apollo as the transfiguring genius of the Principium Individuationis, through which alone the redemption in illusion is truly to be obtained, while by the mystical triumphant cry of Dionysus the spell of individuation is broken, and the way lies open to the mothers of being, to the innermost heart of things. This extraordinary contrast, which stretches like a yawning gulf between plastic art as the Apollonian and music as Dionysian art, has revealed itself to only one of the great thinkers, to such an extent that, Even without this clue to the symbolism of the Hellenic divinities, he conceded to music a character and an origin different from all other arts, because unlike them, it is not a copy of a phenomenon, but an immediate copy of the will itself, and therefore complements everything physical in the world and every phenomenon by representing what is metaphysical, the thing in itself. And he then quotes Schopenhauer. So Schopenhauer is the thinker who, even without appealing to the symbolism of Apollo and Dionysus, understood music as a fundamentally different form of art from the other plastic art forms and visual, physical art forms. Now, a couple things to say about this. For one, the reason why that would be so significant, why Nietzsche gives Schopenhauer so much credit for that, is because, in Hegel and his view of aesthetics, for example, everything is sort of a revelation of the absolute mind when you get right down to it. And there was, I just suppose you could say that there were many theories of aesthetics which attempted to explain all art through a monistic principle of the motivation to do art, or the utility or use of art within one principle from which all forms of art could then be derived or explained. Now, the irony is that Nietzsche will later become a monist in terms of his will to power idea. This is not formulated yet, so there's no contradiction here with him saying that he's going to insist on two differing worlds of art, differing in their intrinsic essence and their highest aims. And basically, we could see these two figures as individuation and dissolution, as he says, spell of principium individuation, and then the spell of individuation being broken. And so you can see this as two directions on a spectrum, right? Well, maybe not a spectrum. It's probably not actually a spectrum. I mean, it's towards being and non-being, and being conceived of as illusory and like arbitrary and established by dreams, and being akin to a dream as a representation of the mind, and music being the complete destruction of those things. And so we can see why Nietzsche, how he derives this from Schopenhauer, because Schopenhauer believes that the will is the primordial basic reality of all life, and that in fact it is in truth undivided, and we are all its essence, that our inner intelligible character is will, and that the world of representations exists within our mind. It only exists at the intersection of the will, of the noumenon, with our minds. That's where the phenomenal world emerges. That's the nature of transcendental idealism. It's not a strict idealism in that there is no external world. It's that this, whatever the external world is, whatever the noumena, these noumenal things are, factors, external factors that are making contact with your sense organs, whatever it may be, quote unquote, in and of itself, the phenomenal world is created upon the intersection of that with your ability to represent the world. And thus all the representations are illusory, and the dissolving of that illusory selfhood, separate individuated selfhood, that is returning to the primordial oneness of the will. And so, again, probably another reason why Kaufman doesn't care for these outer chapters is that Schopenhauer sort of returns in Nietzsche's, in these passages. There's going to be a very long Schopenhauer quotation coming up that we're going to gloss over. But it's important to see how Schopenhauer was influential even on forming these two concepts, and that Nietzsche's later will to power idea actually sort of it's why it makes these concepts sort of outmoded. Now, they can still exist subordinate to will to power, because you could say that there is some sort of power that is expressed or manifested in both of them, right? Both in a greater individuating power and in the ability to dissolve that individuation to the extent that it's done in the way that Nietzsche describes here, in a way that's bounded within like an Apollonian magic circle, can actually serve as a way of inducing one to life, or allowing them to come away with a renewed ability to, to live, right? And so another thing we should bring up here is the footnote of Kaufman that Mozart's not mentioned in The Birth of Tragedy, and yet Nietzsche, he sort of eventually contrasts Mozart and Wagner as with the later recognition that there were some forms of music, Mozart being one of them, that are not Dionysian. That, it did not occur, Kaufman writes in his footnote, it did not occur to him at this time to consider Mozart's music as an alternative to Wagner's. And that he says clearly Nietzsche did not mean to imply that all music is Dionysian. I think Kaufman's actually wrong about that. I think he did mean to imply that. And I think it's only later that I think he's being rather dogmatic in this book, actually, about strictly correlating the Dionysian with music and the Apollonian with the plastic arts, such that all music is actually Dionysian to some extent. And this is a contradiction even in this text, because he admits that there were Apollonian forms of music, like the chanted paean and the instrument of the kithara with its regular strumming rhythm. So maybe Mozart is simply a more fully, a more complex later form of Apollonian expression, right? Maybe that's how you could classify Mozart, but that would mean then that music could actually be Apollonian and not Dionysian. And I think maybe the explanation for that is that all art now, whether musical or visual, like art, there's been such a degree of interaction between these two artistic principles in the human mind for generations now that all of our artistic expression is now mixed. That maybe we could look at this as a genealogy of artistic forces, and that separating them in the same way today doesn't really make sense. And that we should also keep in mind that if the music or artistic expression or whatever is not actually individuating or dissolving the individual, right? If it doesn't have that deep metaphysical significance, it's not actually properly either one of those artistic forces, and is not, in fact, the way Nietzsche talks about it is like a pale imitation, right? And actually, he goes into that a bit in the next paragraph, where he says, quote, "An erroneous aesthetics inspired by a mistaken and degenerate art has, by virtue of the concept of beauty obtaining in the plastic domain, accustomed itself to demand of music an effect similar to that produced by works of plastic art, namely the arousing of delight in beautiful forms. Having recognized this extraordinary contrast, I felt a strong need to approach the essence of Greek tragedy, and with it the profoundest revelation of Hellenic genius." End quote. So he's calling out an aspect of his contemporary art which he considers degenerate. Really, it would seem to me, I don't know if I would actually agree with him that this is a source of a decline of, profundity in art or whatever. I think he's correct that it was a misunderstanding, perhaps, in aesthetic philosophy at the time, that, you have this idea of beauty conceived of as sort of like enjoying like the pleasant sight of beautiful forms, which is something completely distinct from the musical experience in Nietzsche's view. That, he's basically asking, why is it that we are actually classifying the artistic experience, whatever that might be, the point of the artistic experience of like a really like, I don't know, like rapturous, ecstatic experience listening to a symphony? What does that have to do with a Rembrandt painting, right? That they're completely different experiences in some sense, and like he really respects Schopenhauer and is guided by Schopenhauer's attempt to examine and determine just to say that these are actually two different, fundamentally different things. That it's not all, you cannot trace all art back to, say, the pursuit of beauty. That's not even an accurate description of what music is doing. And so Nietzsche in the next paragraph says, what aesthetic effect results when the essentially separate art forces, the Apollonian and the Dionysian, enter into simultaneous activity? Or more briefly, how is music related to image and concept? And so he then says, Schopenhauer, whom Richard Wagner praises for an unsurpassable clearness and clarity of exposition, expresses himself most thoroughly on this subject, which I will cite here at full length. We're not going to go over this passage in full length here. I will just sort of briefly summarize it. But I would say, for one, where he asks, how do the Apollonian and Dionysian enter into simultaneous activity? He's actually kind of already answered that by example in the form of tragedy, with his whole history of the birth and death of tragedy here. And so really he's kind of asking, how can we put this into abstract philosophical language that doesn't specifically relate to the story of tragedy in the ancient Greeks? And so that's why I think he's including this passage here. And again, this passage by Schopenhauer, it's very long. But more or less, we can summarize it by appealing to what the ideas he's already drawn upon in talking about Schopenhauer's views of correlating music to the will itself, or regarding music as, quote, an expression of the world, and calling it, therefore, quote, a universal language. These are all Schopenhauer's words. And we might also remember how Nietzsche discussed the idea of the image or the words accompanying music as secondary phenomenon, and that music in no way depends on the image or the word. And so if we look again within the Schopenhauerian phenomenology, or whatever we want to call it, this makes perfect sense if we translate it into those abstract Schopenhauerian terms. Because if music is, like, in some sense, a more direct expression of the actual, like, metaphysical, ontological nature of reality, of the will, of the boundless, primordial, ever-striving will, the word and the concept, the image concept, the word concept, whatever you want to call them, when we might affix words to give them the power that music offers, right? That's how Nietzsche talks about it earlier in the text. We eventually, that those are sort of like representations, individuated things, illusory individuals that are represented by our minds, carving out these individual phenomena of the world when really they are actually just the undivided, ever-striving will. And so, again, seeing music as the substratum of the whole artistic institution of tragedy, in the same sense, the will is the substratum of reality, just as the imagery of the scene, the words of the poetic verses are things which are affixed later onto the foundation of music, but which the music itself does not need and does not imply and actually has no relation to them. They are simply using the weapons of the Dionysian in order to make their image or their ideal more powerful. That is akin or analogous to representations built upon the foundation of the will, the ontology, the actual substratum of the world. Okay, so perhaps we can look to Nietzsche's words actually to better summarize the Schopenhauer passage where he says, quote, according to the doctrine of Schopenhauer, therefore, we understand music as the immediate language of the will, and we feel our fancy stimulated to give form to this invisible and yet so actively stirred spirit world which speaks to us, and we feel prompted to embody it in an analogous example. On the other hand, image and concept, under the influence of a truly corresponding music, acquire a higher significance. Dionysian art is therefore wont to exercise two kinds of influences on the Apollonian art faculty. Music incites to the symbolic intuition of Dionysian universality, and music allows the symbolic image to emerge in its highest significance. End quote. So, again, that's sort of what we were speaking of before, that because music is the, quote, immediate language of the will. And remember, Nietzsche had some tortured language earlier in this book to try to kind of say how music, like, yeah, it's not technically, the will can't ever be represented, and still your ear is, representation isn't just visual. Your ear represents things, right? The whole world of the senses is representation for what the will is. But there's just something about music that is like more directly related to the intelligible inner content, because the will, right? How do we experience the will? In the form of our passions, our emotions, our pain and our pleasure, our suffering, like the direct sort of inner subjective content of our lives that we can't actually, they're not reducible to like any image or definition outside of themselves, right? How do you describe sadness to someone who's never been sad, or how do you describe emotions to something that had no emotions? It would be very, arguably almost impossible. And so, in some sense, music, even though it is still sort of in the realm of representation, again, I kind of forget the way Nietzsche puts this argument. I guess you can go back to that episode if you want to hear it, but it's more or less the way we're talking about here, that it is the closest thing to the immediate language of the will that we can have because of its emotional power. And so the Apollonian art faculty interacts with it in that it can, the symbolic images which are produced by the Apollonian faculty, which is akin to the dream image, right, can emerge in its highest significance. Well, why is that? Well, because the immediate language of the will can accompany that image and therefore impress itself onto us, impress itself onto our psyche with the full expression of the actual intelligible content of the phenomenon, right? And so what does he say? A little further down, quote, that from this I infer the capacity of music to give birth to myth, the most significant example, and particularly the tragic myth, the myth which expresses Dionysian knowledge and symbols. So remember, the initial symbol which appears on the stage is Lord Dionysus himself, an actor portraying Lord Dionysus, who dies tragically, right? Because Dionysus, it's his essence is to die and be reborn. And that's the essence of all represented things, of which we are, is to, we're part and parcel with the will, which is itself this substratum, which is eternal life, eternal pain and contradiction and suffering, the eternal nature of being, primordial being that exists behind everything. We are part and parcel with that, and yet, so the individual things, the individual personas, the masks of this primordial being arise and pass away, and that's the story we see in the form of Lord Dionysus on stage. And so Nietzsche is sort of saying how his whole study of tragedy shows how music can give birth to myth, because music is actually the origin of tragedy. Okay, and so if we now reflect that music at its highest stage must seek to attain also to its highest objectification in images, we must deem it possible that it also knows how to find the symbolic expression for its unique Dionysian wisdom. And where shall we seek for this expression if not in tragedy, and in general in the conception of the tragic? From the nature of art as it is usually conceived, according to the single category of appearance and beauty, the tragic cannot honestly be deduced at all. It is only through the spirit of music that we can understand the joy involved in the annihilation of the individual. According to the single category of appearance and beauty, sort of the old monistic ideas of aesthetic principles, the tragic can't really be honestly understood on its own terms, because it is the joy of the annihilation of the individual. It belies the Socratic mind, right? The theoretic approach to life. Quote, for it is only in particular examples of such annihilation that we see clearly the eternal phenomenon of Dionysian art, which gives expression to the will in its omnipotence, as it were, behind the principium individuationis, the eternal life beyond all phenomena and despite all annihilation, end quote. So that's what I was just talking about a moment before, actually. That Dionysian substratum is this idea. I mean, remember Nietzsche said that, or not Nietzsche, Schopenhauer says in his World is Will and Representation that someone who had penetrated to the sort of highest Schopenhauerian metaphysical wisdom, but didn't understand that life was just suffering, like didn't understand how bad life is, didn't understand the negative, happiness principle or whatever, would just see death as an empty phantasm and would just say, well, that's, absurd. I am this eternally living being, and this life is just a dream, and I will continue existing as the will long after this dream has ended, right? And so that's sort of the Dionysian joy and how it can be an inducement to life. And so Nietzsche says, quote, "The metaphysical joy in the tragic is a translation of the instinctive, unconscious Dionysian wisdom into the language of images. The hero, the highest manifestation of the will, is negated for our pleasure because he is only phenomenon and because the eternal life of the will is not affected by his annihilation. We believe in eternal life," exclaims tragedy, "while music is the immediate idea of this life. Plastic art has an altogether different aim. Here Apollo overcomes the suffering of the individual by the radiant glorification of the eternity of the phenomenon. Here beauty triumphs over the suffering inherent in life. Pain is obliterated by lies from the features of nature." And so that, very wonderful, and again, a statement of what's so different about the Apollonian versus the Theoretic, is that it is redemption through lies. It's art's war on reality, the attempt to stamp becoming with being and eternalize. This is all sort of described, I think, in Plato's Symposium as well, where Socrates, in paraphrasing the high priestess Diotima, classifies Eros as every being's attempt to sort of partake of eternity, and that we, individual phenomenal beings, unlike the gods who endure forever, we don't taste of immortality by being the same forever and enduring in the same form, but by giving rise to new forms that themselves arise and pass away and give rise to new forms. And so I make reference to that because I think that will to eternity is what's expressed by Apollo, and perhaps this is some of that silent hostility at Christianity by calling the eternity of the phenomenon a lie, right? Because that is what is implied here, is that that is a lie, but that is another potent way of overcoming the suffering of mortality, is with the by the crafting of the myth of the eternalization of everything that we value and hold dear. And we could say that in some sense, Nietzsche attempts both those Dionysian and the Apollonian art forces, both of their attempts to overcome the suffering of the world. He concludes the section by saying that in Dionysian art, nature cries to us, quote, "Be as I am. Amid the ceaseless flux of all phenomena, I am the eternally creative primordial mother, eternally impelling to existence, eternally finding satisfaction in the change of phenomena," end quote. And so there is a very Heraclitean undercurrent, I think, in terms of Nietzsche's instincts and his the whole tone of a lot of what is said here, even though Heraclitus is only mentioned, I think, the one time. So we'll move on to 17, and where he opens basically sort of recapitulating to that, saying that Dionysian art also wants to convince us of the eternal joy of existence, that only the Apollonian wishes for us to seek it in phenomena, whereas the Dionysian seeks for joy behind all phenomena, in the sort of communion with the undivided will itself. And he says, quote, "We are really for a brief moment primordial being itself, feeling its raging desire for existence and joy in existence. The struggle, the pain, the destruction of phenomena now appear necessary to us in view of the excess of countless forms of existence which force and push one another into life, in view of the exuberant fertility of the universal will. We are pierced by the maddening sting of these pains just when we have become, as it were, one with the infinite primordial joy in existence, and when we anticipate, in Dionysian ecstasy, the indestructibility and eternity of this joy. In spite of fear and pity, we are the happy living beings, not as individuals, but as the one living being with whose creative joy we are united," end quote. And so, again, I guess I would just reiterate that Nietzsche was very serious in the preface, where he says that an artist's metaphysics lies behind this book, and that he does seem to really believe he has interpreted Schopenhauer's doctrine of the primordial will into, he speaks of it in poetic terms throughout as this one primordial being, suffering and living being, which manifests itself in the form of Dionysus, who is ever reborn, torn apart and destroyed. this great hero who is exemplary, who's always negated for our pleasure in the form of drama, because we can take pleasure when we self-identify with that primordial God of whom we are all a part. And so this is very Indian, it's very Hindu, it's very, to the extent that it's pagan, it's sort of like pan worship. Again, it's very pantheistic. And so next paragraph, he sort of recaps again, telling us how, historical analysis has shown that tragic art came from the spirit of music, and now we can finally understand the chorus and the meaning of tragic myth, which he says we can actually understand better than the Greek poets did and the philosophers, because the meaning of the tragic myth actually was never clear to them in their own time. They didn't have the benefit of the historical analysis we can now undertake. And so he says, quote, their heroes speak, as it were, more superficially than they act. The myth does not at all obtain adequate objectification in the spoken word. The structure of the scenes and visual images reveal a deeper wisdom than the poet himself can put into words and concepts. The same is also observable in Shakespeare, whose Hamlet, for instance, similarly talks more superficially than he acts, so that the previously mentioned lesson of Hamlet is to be deduced not from his words, but from a profound contemplation and study of the whole. End quote. And so, in some sense, this is Nietzsche's apologia for why he might differ with many traditional views of the ancients, and even the ancients themselves as they interpreted their own culture. But I think he has a very, a compelling example or analogy from a more modern source in Hamlet. I say more modern, even though, Shakespeare's hundreds of years before him, but not nearly as distant as the Greeks. And I think that is a perfectly fair characterization of the character of Hamlet. Nevertheless, the next paragraph, which I'm also going to gloss over, he sort of... he says, I've intimated that the lack of congruity between myth and expression might easily lead us to regard it as shallower and less significant than it really is, and attribute to it a more superficial effect than it must have had, according to the testimony of the ancients. And sort of, that it might be difficult for us to actually believe that the individual self was negated just out of sheer ecstasy and absorption in the primordial whole at these Greek festivals, because we have nothing, he says that even the musical superiority of the Greeks would only have been felt by us if we had been Greeks. So we might think of the scene in Faust Part 2 where Helen of Troy and Paris appear before the court of the emperor, and the men don't find Helen as beautiful as they don't find they're very beautiful, and they find Paris somewhat unimpressive. And it's sort of it was Goethe's attempt at demonstrating how the past really is a foreign country, and we really don't understand the Greeks as directly and intimately as we claim to, or as we might think we do. And so Nietzsche, I think, just takes a paragraph to remind us that, or to try and open our minds to the possibility that, in fact, this negation of the individual and experience of being the one living being and self-identifying with that, with the substratum of terrible nature beneath all things at the Dionysian festival, that this might actually have been possible. Like, imagine that. And don't simply dismiss it because our minds are so foreign from what the Greek mind might have been. Next paragraph, quote, that striving of the spirit of music toward visual and mythical objectification, which increases from the beginnings of lyric poetry up to Attic tragedy, suddenly breaks off after attaining a luxuriant development and disappears, as it were, from the surface of Hellenic art, while the Dionysian worldview, born of this striving, lives on in the mysteries and in its strangest metamorphoses and debasements does not cease to attract serious natures. Will it not someday rise once again out of the mystic depths as art? End quote. And so basically, these impulses did not go away. The Dionysian, once it disappears from Hellenic art, continues on in the mysteries. It goes back to just being the ecstatic rituals by the mystery cults, and Nietzsche sort of implies that it's existed all along beneath our society and asks the question, can it once again manifest as art? Next paragraph, he asks about whether the theoretic worldview that has most been the noblest force opposing the tragic could prevent this Dionysian force from ever arising again. He says, quote, if ancient tragedy was diverted from its course by the dialectical desire for knowledge and the optimism of science, this fact might lead us to believe that there is an eternal conflict between the theoretic and the tragic worldview. And only after the spirit of science has been pursued to its limits and its claim to universal validity destroyed by the evidence of these limits may we hope for a rebirth of tragedy, a form of culture for which we should have to use the symbol of the music-practicing Socrates in the sense spoken above. In this contrast, I understand by the spirit of science the faith that first came to light in the person of Socrates, the faith in the explicability of nature and in knowledge as a panacea. And so the ending, again, we can see this in the idea of the gay science. That is the artistic Socrates, a science which is not dispassionate and sees itself as free from myth and illusion, but a science that gaily accepts itself as rooted in art, rooted in myth, and is as unification of the artistic forces, the passions, the world of appearance, the world that is arbitrary and irrational and cruel, unified with the world that is cool-headed and calm and rational and based on reason. And so, again, he poses the question, is there an eternal conflict between the theoretic and the tragic? He here asserts, he basically asserts in so many words that he hopes no. He hopes that the answer will actually be the synthesis in the music-practicing Socrates. Quote, he who recalls the immediate consequences of this restlessly progressing spirit of science will realize at once that myth was annihilated by it, and that because of this annihilation, poetry was driven like a homeless being from her natural ideal soil. If we have been right in assigning to music the power of again giving birth to myth, we may similarly expect to find the spirit of science on the path where it inimically opposes the mythopoeic power of music. This takes place in the development of the new Etic dithyramb, the music of which no longer expressed the inner essence, the will itself, but only rendered the phenomenon inadequately and an imitation by means of concepts. From this intrinsically degenerate music, the genuinely musical natures turned away with the same repugnance that they felt for the art-destroying tendency of Socrates. The unerring instinct of Aristophanes was surely right when it included Socrates himself, the tragedy of Euripides, and the music of the new dithyrambic poets, and the same feeling of hatred, recognizing in all three phenomena the signs of a degenerate culture. So, end quote. And so, Nietzsche, once again, you may notice Aristophanes is someone Nietzsche speaks of. He's a comedic writer. Nietzsche speaks of quite fondly throughout. And Aristophanes is not often mentioned as an influence on Nietzsche, but every time he brings him up, it's to agree with him. The other thing I would point out is that the idea we'll distill from this paragraph is, again, to say, okay, so if it's this opposition between the theoretic and the tragic, even though Nietzsche's hoping for a reconciliation of sorts, he poses the question, if myth is really the thing that science opposes, will science be completely inimical to the birth of a new myth, and therefore always opposed to the power of music in that sense? Again, this is getting very abstract. It's like once we leave chapter 15 and get into these later sections, it's like I appreciate and respect what he's trying to do. He's trying to take the specific example in which he understood many of these concepts about art of ancient Greek tragedy, and I think he's trying to abstract from them certain things. But I think in ordinary parlance or day-to-day life, it's very hard to for me at certain times in this work to understand, even though I understand what he's saying sort of on a macro level, it's very difficult to see how science would be. Is science opposed to music in our day-to-day life? I mean, we certainly see it in Socrates and in the Republic. And we certainly see like the shadow of Socrates, the theoretic, optimistic, moralistic view of the world in terms of utilitarianism today and how it dominates, I think, the world, which, Nietzsche's later theory is how Socratism sort of degenerates into Christianity, and then the pitying content of Christianity takes over everything, and that's sort of what's driving it. But we can still see like those basic three elements of theoretic, moral, optimistic in modern utilitarian thought, and we can see how that could be still casting a shadow on our culture. But is it fundamentally against music? Right? Do we find that as a cultural battle that is being waged today? I don't necessarily think so. There are some ways in which I think this work, it's arguable, certainly, how applicable some of Nietzsche's cultural criticisms are to today. So the next paragraph, he talks about the new dithyramb, which, as he said, it's a music no longer express the inner essence. I mean, remember the original dithyramb. It's a drunken, spontaneous, irregular rhythm. The new dithyramb, he says, quote, music is outrageously manipulated so as to be the imitative counterfeit of phenomenon. For instance, a battle or storm at sea. And thus, of course, it has been utterly robbed of its mythopoeic power. So rather than the word concepts and image concepts being fitted to suit the music, being built upon the foundation of music and trying to carry the music, the power of music in order to enforce their conceptualization on the world. Instead, music, in Nietzsche's charge in the new dithyramb, is manipulated to serve the concept, and that this is, sort of mirrors art or poetry as the handmaiden of philosophy, as we talked about before. And so he's seeing this emergence of the new dithyramb as part and parcel of this Socratic zeitgeist, or the theoretic zeitgeist opposed to the tragic. Because by now we can see how the tragic and the Dionysian and the spirit of music, all of these things are interrelated. Skipping a little further down, in the paragraph, he says, quote, the truly Dionysian music presents itself as such a general mirror of the universal will. The vivid event refracted in this mirror expands at once for our consciousness to the copy of an external truth. Conversely, such a vivid event is at once divested of every mythical character by the tone painting of the new dithyramb. Music now becomes a wretched copy of the phenomenon, and therefore infinitely poorer than the phenomenon itself. And through this poverty, it still further reduces the phenomenon for our consciousness, so that now, for example, a musically imitated battle of this sort exhausts itself in marches, signal sounds, etc., and our imagination is arrested precisely by these superficialities. Tone painting is thus in every respect the opposite of true music with its mythopoeic power. And so, it's very interesting. I think that's all very clear given what we've been talking about. The music becomes a copy of the phenomenon instead of the phenomenon attempting to embody the music, or however you might put it. And maybe this is because he used the term true Dionysian music. Maybe we could see that music that is un-Dionysian in some way. I'm not going to make any claims as to how to determine who is un-Dionysian. So I'm not going to say it's Mozart, right? For example, even though Kaufman says it might be Mozart, but we might say that because I don't think this necessarily applies to Mozart, but one of the ways that we could say that music that's un-Dionysian is produced is by attempting to use musical techniques for the contrived purpose of producing some sound, like he says, creating the musical image of like what a battle sounds like. And so introducing marching rhythms and a musically imitated battle, which is a superficial manipulation of music. It's not letting the inner content of the music guide its direction. It's not an eruption of the will, producing some melody, right? It's the power and the forcefulness of the melody which impresses itself in your psyche, and then you write the lyrics around it. Nietzsche thinks the sculpting of music in this conscious way is, it says it right here, it's the opposite of true music with its mythopoeic power. So true music, right, has the power, has the mythopoeic power, the power to shape and give birth to new myths. Okay. What does he say at the end? He says, quote, Euripides, who though in a higher sense must be considered a thoroughly unmusical nature, is for this very reason a passionate adherent of new dithyrambic music, and with the liberality of a robber makes use of all its effective tricks and mannerisms, end quote. So again, playing on the heartstrings using the technique of music to achieve the desired effect versus a true Dionysian music, which is mythopoeic. And I just wanted to include this because it's another shot at Euripides, which we could also, again, question whether that's actually deserved. And so in the ensuing paragraphs, Nietzsche, what follows is sort of just a criticism of what we would say the downfall of tragedy according to this tendency obtaining more and more in the art form. And he starts with Sophocles, where he says, even in Sophocles, there is a prevalence of character representation and psychological refinement. Quote, the character must no longer be expanded into an eternal type, but on the contrary must develop individually through artistic subordinate traits and shadings. Skipping further down, in such a manner that the spectator is in general no longer conscious of the myth, but of the vigorous truth to nature and the artist's imitative power, end quote. So, problem begins again with Sophocles, where we get the first inklings of it, and we may remember Nietzsche's rejection of naturalism in art, and how what's really being spoken of here is the artist's imitative power, his technique for as exactly representing individuals as possible, whereas before, the hero was always an eternal type. Remember, they were initially all facsimiles of Dionysus, right? So it's an archetype you're seeing on the stage. You're seeing something idealized, something which is beyond the human, and which, like he says in an earlier passage, it's like each character seems to have a comet tail trailing behind them. There's such mysterious depths to all the characters because they are these mysterious eternal archetypes which stand beyond and above humanity. Then he says, quote, while Sophocles still portrays complete characters and employs myth for the refined development, Euripides already draws only prominent individual traits of character, which can express themselves in violent bursts of passion. In the New Attic comedy, however, there are only masks with one expression: frivolous old men, duped panders, and cunning slaves, recurring incessantly, end quote. So there's a phenomenon, I forget exactly what it's called, but it happens in a lot of like long-running television shows and such, where characters have like one or two outstanding traits, right? And then they slowly become caricatures of themselves, where, it's like Homer Simpson, he's fat and stupid, right? Over time, he becomes like, you always have to raise the stakes, right? Oh, he did something stupid and that's funny, so he becomes stupider and stupider and stupider, and eventually he becomes like a caricature of a human being that's like one note. Or like, I don't know. There's a lot of commentary on that. I don't want to go through many more specific examples, but where the character sort of has one or two defining traits, and then eventually they just become just one thing. And it's sort of like a like degradation, a complete superficiality of artwork, where you have these it's like becoming one-dimensional, basically, is what Nietzsche's saying. And so that's what he means, that after Euripides and the New Attic comedy, there's only masks with one expression. And then he asks, quote, where now is the mythopoeic spirit of music? What still remains of music is either excitatory or reminiscent music, that is, either a stimulant for dull and faded nerves or tone painting. So in any case, that's what he just condemned, tone painting, as being the opposite of genuine music. And remember, in this period, music was just sort of something that punctuated the intervals of scenes. And then he says in the next paragraph, quote, the new un-Dionysian spirit reveals itself most plainly in the denouements of the new dramas, In the old tragedy, one could sense at the end that metaphysical comfort without which the delight in tragedy cannot be explained at all. The reconciling tones from another world sound purest, perhaps, in the Oedipus at Colonus. And remember, that's sort of the idea that Oedipus is shamed, he's destroyed, his life is ruined, and he is just there to endure all he can do is endure the suffering with passivity. And yet, as he dies, a sort of magic healing power emanates from his dying place. That sort of indicates that this was there's like a metaphysical justification for Oedipus, or a redemption that is, it's not framed as an actual redemption for the character. We see in brutal honesty the destruction of this great man, nevertheless, or of this, this great hero who had the wisdom, the excessive wisdom to answer the riddle of the Sphinx and is punished for his crime against nature, right? He's great in that he has an excess. If we go back to section 9, he says, through his tremendous suffering, spreads a magical power of blessing that remains effective even beyond his decease. The unfortunate Oedipus, he's the noble human being who, in spite of his wisdom, is destined to error and misery, right? And so then Nietzsche says, quote, the noble human being does not sin, the profound poet wants to tell us. So in place of like the deus ex machina of the poetic justice, right, the idea that the character actually needs to be recompensed for virtue and vice needs to be punished, and the wise, noble character can't be just arbitrarily and indifferently destroyed by a cruel reality, because that wouldn't be right. So Nietzsche says, in contrast to that, in the old tragedy, the reconciling tones from another world sound purest, perhaps in Oedipus at Colonus, where it's almost like a blessing of the gods even upon the tragic end of this man. That it's like a metaphysical comfort that we can derive because it blesses an actual honest rendering of our reality, rather than attempting to warp reality through through our intellect going in and correcting being in artistic form, right? Okay. So he says, quote, now that the genius of music has fled from tragedy, strictly speaking, is dead. For from what source shall we now draw this metaphysical comfort? The new spirit therefore sought for an earthly resolution of the tragic dissonance. The hero, after being sufficiently tortured by fate, earned a well-deserved reward through a splendid marriage or tokens of divine favor. The hero had turned gladiator, on whom, after he had been nicely beaten and covered with wounds, freedom was occasionally bestowed. The deus ex machina took the place of metaphysical comfort. So that's very important. It's the metaphysical comfort, as he's been saying it. And I hope we can not have any baggage attached to metaphysics, given all the caveats I've said about Nietzsche's metaphysics at this time. The metaphysical comfort we're talking about is that artistic rendition of an honest picture of nature in which it's a completely unjust world, and yet the hero who is destroyed is nevertheless blessed. He's not a sinner. The deus ex machina is saying, no, there is a God in the machine that watches over events that's not going to allow the hero who has acted properly and morally to actually be destroyed. And so that's the end of tragedy, right? And again, as I've said, we can think, if we call to mind the majority of our most popular cultural productions today, they do abide by the poetic justice model, by the deus ex machina model, and typically not the tragic metaphysical comfort model, because even the sort of non-optimistic films that I listed earlier, that are sort of more recent examples of blockbusters that were not good guy win in the end type blockbusters, like No Country for Old Men and There Will Be Blood. Both those movies are more than 10 years old now, too, so it's not really modern or not really strictly contemporary, but those are not exactly tragic in the proper sense that Nietzsche is using it, because they don't instill you with the metaphysical comfort. Maybe No Country for Old Men does, with Tommy Lee Jones's dream at the end. Maybe that's a form of metaphysical comfort. So maybe that's an ideal tragic movie for the modern age. But anyway, I think these are more these kinds of questions, when we take this Nietzschean view of art and apply it to our own culture. In some ways, it'll be incongruous, but in other ways, it's actually very fertile ground for our own questions and to think about it. So I'm not going to give you any more answers. So he says, I will not say that the tragic worldview was everywhere completely destroyed by this intruding on Dionysian spirit. We only know that it had to flee from art into an underworld, as it were, in the degenerate form of a secret cult. So that's what we touched on earlier with the Dionysian returning to the mystery cults, right? Over the widest extent of the Hellenic character, however, there raged the consuming blast of the spirit, which manifests in the form of Greek cheerfulness, which we have already spoken of as a senile, unproductive love of existence. This cheerfulness stands opposed to the splendid naivete of the earlier Greeks, which, according to the characterization given above, must be conceived as the blossom of the Apollonian culture springing from a dark abyss, as the victory which the Hellenic will, through the mirroring of beauty, obtains over suffering and the wisdom of suffering. So remember, Nietzsche saying it's not naive cheerfulness. The cheerfulness of the Greeks was of the later Greeks, and it's a product of the theoretical worldview, of their senile, unproductive love of existence. That's, I think, very clear. And the naive earlier Greek was not naive and, in this state of cheerful, sedate, idyllic oneness with nature, but was a terrifying force that had to throw down titans and slay monsters and hold out the Gorgon's head to the, waves of Dionysian power that threatened to overwhelm their civilization. And through that mirroring of beauty, through the dream power of Apollo, found the will to continue existing in the light of the shining Olympian deities. That was their naivete, was a naive innocence in violence and a love of aesthetic beauty that created a sort of weird religious morality that was itself beyond good and evil, in Nietzsche's view anyway. The noblest manifestation of that other form of Greek cheerfulness, this is Nietzsche again, the Alexandrian, is the cheerfulness of the theoretical man. And so we now get a definition of what the Alexandrian is. That the shift of eras from the Hellenic to the Alexandrian is the triumph of the theoretic over the tragic. That the Hellenic culture was a tragic culture. It was a culture who had this view of nature, which nevertheless used the tragic as a metaphysical comfort in order to bless life and go on living. The theoretic, optimistic view negated the tragic pessimism and produced this theoretic approach of this insatiable love for optimistic knowledge. So Nietzsche finishes the paragraph, quote, "It exhibits the same characteristic symptoms that I have just deduced from the spirit of the un-Dionysian. It combats Dionysian wisdom and art. It seeks to dissolve myth. It substitutes for a metaphysical comfort an earthly consonance, in fact, a deus ex machina of its own. A god of machines and crucibles, that is, the powers of spirits of nature recognized and employed in the service of a higher egoism. It believes that it can correct the world by knowledge, guide life by science, and actually confine the individual within a sphere of solvable problems, from which he can cheerfully say to life, 'I desire you, you are worth knowing.'" And so again, one final thing I'll say before we end is that Nietzsche once again emphasizes how the theoretic was an inducement to life. We might remember how he says that Christianity, this is in his notes on nihilism and will to power, we talked about that in the episode on nihilism, that what he can say in favor of Christianity was that it was a solution to the problem of nihilism, even though it ultimately made the problem worse in the long run, and that we now have to pay for having been Christians for 2,000 years. It was an answer. And so, we have to pay it due respects in some sense as a result of that. And so, all of these things that Nietzsche said, we can now see how he sees they're dangerous and how it's a tragedy, no pun intended, that it killed the Dionysian tragic and drove it underground again into the cults and to the ritual spaces and out of the, that the dramatic public, performances of ritual became so superficial and contrived, and that the theoretic basically, ruined all of that. But this belief, correcting the world by knowledge, guiding life by science, confining the individual within a limited sphere of solvable problems, it's a way of saying to life, making life, what would you say? Again, when I brought it up before, making every phenomena in life worthy of our attention, of deep significance, because it's of significance to science as a scientific phenomena. Making life justified because it is in the world of phenomena in which we can pursue the objects of knowing, pursue knowledge being the point of life, right? And so even though this eventually causes problems, the sacrifice of life at the altar of truth, right? The dying Socrates, and the fact that the ability to revivify our myths in our culture and keep our culture alive has been basically stifled and opposed by this theoretic ascendancy. Nevertheless, that theoretic worldview gives us a way of justifying life and making life good for something, right? Giving life value as a source of knowledge and as a place to pursue knowledge. And insofar as it did that, that maybe could relate to the earlier passages of Socratism basically preventing perhaps a far worse fate of the just running wild of egoistic, subjective, like practical concerns, and that the cool, restrained virtue and all things in moderation, and virtue is knowledge, and knowledge is supreme, all of these maxims of Socratism did have a benefit. And of course they did, or it never would have transformed society, and Socrates would not have been the turning point of world history that he was if that wasn't true. And so it's good to always keep that in mind, even in this work where Nietzsche spends a great deal of time criticizing the Socratic. Okay, thanks everyone. We'll see you next week. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimelyreflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.